Hello and welcome to Healthy Seminars. I'm your host, Lauren Brown, and we are continuing with our series of what I wish I included in my textbook. And today we have coming back with us Rebecca Avern, and her textbook is called Acupuncture in Babies, Children, and Teenagers. And she did a lecture recently for us on Shoni Shin. And today the topic is on eczema, understanding and treating eczema through a wider lens. Before we do that, I just want to let you know that Rebecca has a few lectures online at Healthy Seminars, including one that's coming up on October 11th, 2020, on the acupuncture for childhood and teenage anxiety. So if you want to attend that live webinar, and then it'll be on demand afterwards, like the rest of them are here. And just to remind you, on Healthy Seminars, if you want to watch this recording, it will be up for 48 hours after this live stream, and it will show up on the page that we have for what I wish I included in my textbook, which is healthyseminars.com/wish. Or if you go to the resources, this link's on any homepage here. So if you go to resources, it's our community, unity, immunity section. If you just scroll down to the calendar to September 24th and click on that, that will take you to this page, and then you can see and watch the recording there. I want to remind you for our disclaimer that this lecture, this talk is for educational purposes only. This is not medical advice. It should not be intended as medical advice. Again, this is for educational purposes only. Thank you for that. So I want to welcome back Rebecca Avern. She's out of the UK, and she's an acupuncturist with a focus on pediatrics. She's written a textbook. She's done several lectures. I know she's got more books coming forth, and she's always a treat to hear some tips. And Rebecca, I know that you wrote a book. And like any author, after you write a book, once it's published, you already have new ideas that you want to include in the book because you're constantly evolving. And plus, your editors are always taking things out. And so now that this book is published, what do you wish you could still include in your book?
Thanks, Lauren. So what I wish I could include in my book about eczema, I'm going to rush through these points because we have a set amount of time. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I think as a practitioner, when we have a baby or a child come with bad eczema, we can immediately get into thinking that this is a pathology that we have to fix. But actually, in some cases, in many cases, in babies and toddlers particularly, I think that eczema is actually a stage of development and a necessary stage of development. So Sun Si Miao talked about phases of kind of intense growth called transformations and steamings, where babies would expel yang and become more yin. So become kind of more human in a way. So every time they would go through one of these, they would become a bit less yang and a bit more yin. But kids these days don't really have the chance to go through these transformations and steamings in the way that they once would have. Partly because they don't get the kind of big childhood illnesses because they're vaccinated, and partly because when they get mild fevers, the fever's often suppressed with medication. So as a result of this, the fetal toxins and the fetal heat, which they bring with them into the world, are trapped in their body. And eczema is sometimes a way of a child trying to get rid of these fetal toxins. So it just means that we need to change our emphasis a bit when we're treating these children on encouraging the pathogens outwards. So opening up the solely at the surface of the body and supporting the circulation of qi and blood and allowing a way out for the fetal toxins via the skin. Always, while we're doing this, we need to try and make the child as comfortable as possible by reducing itching. So we need to bear that in mind too. And Sun Si Miao talked about these transformations and steamings as times when children would often go through a massive kind of maturation. And I think it's very interesting that when you're treating eczema, it often dramatically improves after the child has had a fever. So that's something you need to talk to parents about in a safe way, allowing the child to express the heat via a fever. And eczema also often improves when a child becomes verbal. So this kind of backs up Sun Si Miao's idea that these transformations and steamings that we can actually allow to happen with our treatment are important developmental leaps. So whenever you're treating eczema, it's important to ask yourself the question, what's going on in the child's intestines? So the skin can be seen as a mirror image of the internal state of the intestines. So one thing you need to do when you're treating eczema is to focus on regulating the bowels. So if there's any food accumulation, which is very common in babies and young children, then it's really important to clear that, talk to the parents about diet and get the bowels regular. Because if you don't do that, you're going to have very limited success with just treating the manifestation of the eczema. And I have increasingly over the last few years included points that directly affect the intestines when I'm treating eczema. So the HSI points like stomach 37 and stomach 39, small intestine 5, which being the fire point helps to clear heat from the intestines. And whilst it's important to look at diet, I also think it's important not to see eczema as a product of the wrong diet. I think that it's a very easy thing to sort of pin everything on. And a lot of parents come convinced that there is something in their child's diet that's causing the eczema. And of course, you need to be a bit of a detective and see if that seems to be the case. But it's not necessarily the case. And if you regulate the child's digestion, then they should be able to tolerate most foods, within reason, of course. The third point that I wanted to make about eczema is that in older children, eczema can arise because of yin fire. So a lot of older children have yin fire because their spleen's very deficient, because they're studying too hard, they're not eating well, they're exercising too hard. So the eczema in these cases of yin fire tends to be worse on the top part of the body, and it's often very bad on the face, which is, really difficult for older children to deal with when they're becoming very self-conscious. And the eczema looks very red and hot, but the child feels cold and tired. So there's a mismatch between what's going on the skin and the internal state of the qi of the child. So it's, in this case, the treatment principles are to really nourish the spleen and to bring the minister fire back down to where it belongs in the lower burner. And in doing that, it's amazing how it clears up all this kind of redness and eczema on the top part of the body. And in those cases, it's also important to talk to the children about how this pathology has arisen. So to help them with adjusting their study patterns, their exercise patterns, etc., their diet, so that their spleen is better looked after. Of course, communicating with parents is always crucially important when we're treating their children. But eczema takes a long time to successfully treat in many cases. And I would say of all the conditions that I see in the pediatric clinic, it's the one that I find it the hardest to predict with any degree of accuracy how long the treatment's going to take. And as you treat eczema, as you go along the way of treating it, there are always setbacks along the way. Very often the child gets a bit better at first and the parent and the child are excited, and then you have a setback, and it's easy at that time for the parent to kind of lose faith in your treatment. So I now make a real point of very clearly explaining to the parent when I first meet them that to bring about a lasting change, it's important that I see the child over a period of months. And I also warn them that there are going to be ups and downs along the way. I think it's also reassuring for parents to say to them that if at any point I don't feel I'm getting anywhere, I will immediately tell them. But also that setbacks can give us really important information. So setbacks aren't just a negative thing that happens. They can be useful. And a lot of parents that bring their children for acupuncture feel really guilty if they use any steroid cream on their child. And we, of course, all know that steroid cream is far from ideal. You know, we do not want children relying on steroids. It has, you know, short-term and long-term side effects. However, there is a place occasionally for helping a child for a few days through a really bad patch of eczema to use steroid creams. And I think to help the parents, it doesn't help anyone if the parent is feeling racked with guilt every time they use them. That's actually going to negatively impact the chi of the child. So it's really useful to have conversations around that and to recognize that there is a place for steroid cream sometimes. And also related to diet, as I mentioned before, to bring the focus back in our conversation with parents to the internal state of the child rather than purely focusing on the external triggers. So a bit like the whole world is doing now with COVID, we're focusing on the virus rather than on our internal state and therefore how we will respond to the virus. And the same with children with eczema. If we can get their internal balance really good, then they're not going to react to the external environment in the way that they have been. And a couple of final tips. So as well as treating the systemic patterns, sometimes there are really set in patches of eczema, and even though the rest of the body seems to be generally clearing up, these few recalcitrant patches just don't seem to be changing. And in those cases, it's really useful to use a Shonishin tapping technique, or on an older child, a 7-star hammer, just around the outside of the eczema patch, which sort of enlivens the flow of qi and blood to the area and helps it to heal. So I will show parents how to do that at home as well on a regular basis. And don't base your diagnosis only on the look of the eczema. The eczema might be red and hot. The child might be cold and yangshu. Both those can coexist. And what's showing on the surface of the skin doesn't necessarily tell us everything about the internal state of the child's chi and blood and fluids and all the rest of it. And one final thing is that I mentioned at the start that it's really important to manage the itching. The itching is what makes eczema so unbearable in young children. In older children, it's how it looks as well. But in younger children, it's the itching that's unbearable. It disturbs the sleep of both parents and child and makes everyone miserable. And it's awful for a parent to have to witness their 6-month-old baby just wanting to scratch and scratch all the time. And the scratching opens up the skin and then makes it, brings about the possibility of infection. So treating the itching is crucial. And having tried all the kind of extra points that calm itching and lots of other approaches for calming itching, the one that I find consistently works is treating the heart. So the kind of agitation of the itching is synonymous with the kind of agitation of the shen. And if you can calm and settle the shen, then you will calm and settle the itching. So that should always be your number one priority before you even diagnose the other patterns involved. So that is what I wish I had put in my book about eczema.
Thank you very much. And to remind everybody, this whole series is what I wish I included in my book. So she has a chapter on pediatric eczema in her book. And then this is what she would like to add to that chapter. So definitely check out her book so you can find out the details of how she treats eczema. And I have 2 questions for you, Rebecca, before we wrap up. Just to remind you that Rebecca has approved courses for CEU PDAs online at Healthy Seminars. And hope you join us for her upcoming live webinar on teenage anxiety. One of the questions was, for eczema and psoriasis, do you bring in the Western diagnosis into how you treat somebody with eczema or psoriasis? Because somebody said they don't really know how to, it's not in their scope. So does it matter the way you practice, whether it's psoriasis or eczema that you're seeing on the skin?
No, it really doesn't matter. I make my TCM diagnosis and treat according to that. And you get kids come in with all sorts of diagnoses, dermatitis and seborrheic dermatitis and psoriasis and eczema. And it makes no difference for me to the way that I will treat the child. I just make my own diagnosis.
Perfect. And then you had talked about the yin fire and ministerial fire, bringing it back. And somebody said, can you talk a little on how do you bring the ministerial fire back to where it belongs?
So you basically do it by strengthening the stomach and spleen. And it's also helpful, as well as using points to do that, to use points like Ren 4 and Ren 6, which sit over the area where you want to bring the minister fire back to. So it's essentially a weakness of the stomach and spleen, which lets the minister fire flare up to the top of the body. By strengthening it, you're going to bring it back down into the lower burner.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Rebecca Avern. And again, check out her replay if you like. It's up for 48 hours at her textbook is Acupuncture for Babies, Children, and Teenagers. And her replay will be up on healthyseminars.com/wish for 48 hours if you want to catch the replay. Rebecca, thanks for putting this together. my colleagues and friends out there, thanks for joining us, for your questions. And if you have other authors that you want them to come on, send them my way. We'd love to have more authors here talking about what they wish they included in their textbook. Rebecca, until next time, enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.